In 1791, George Washington personally reviewed Pierre Charles L'Enfant's plan for the federal capital, the same plan that placed star-shaped earthwork structures at 7 key intersections across the proposed city. Washington approved the plan in writing. The structures appeared in L'Enfant's drawings with more precision than any other single feature. Not walls, not roads, not the residence of the president. Then, without recorded debate, without a single documented objection, they were removed from the final construction orders. L'Enfant was dismissed 8 months later. The capital was built. The 7 positions remained empty. No official document explains why those specific structures were removed and nothing placed there instead. I came to the star forts through a photograph, not a dramatic one. A photograph my father took in 1987 on a fishing trip in rural Virginia, developed at a drugstore and kept in a shoebox for 30 years. In the background, behind him holding a smallmouth bass with the particular pride of a man who has caught something larger than expected, there is a raised earthen ridge. Its line is too straight to be natural. Its angle, where it meets a second ridge at the edge of the frame, is too precise. I had looked at that photograph 100 times without seeing what was behind him. When I finally saw it, I couldn't stop. I drove to that county on a Saturday in early spring. I found the structure on the second day, off an unmarked dirt road about a mile from where my father had been fishing. It was larger than I expected. The points of the star extended outward from the centre, 6 of them, with a geometric confidence that felt completely foreign to the surrounding landscape of soft hills and old hardwood. The grass was brown and matted from winter. The angles were sharp. I walked the perimeter slowly, trying to understand what I was looking at, and found no evidence of any structure that had ever stood inside the earthwork. Walls, no foundation stones, no post holes, no sign of artillery positions or anything that might hold a cannon in place. Just the geometry, precise and patient, sitting in a field with no explanation and no audience. The local historical marker, mounted on a post about 50 yards from the nearest point, called it a Civil War defensive earthwork. I wrote down the date it gave and drove to the county courthouse that afternoon. There were no troop movement records for this location. No engagement was documented within 20 miles. No supply chain, no garrison record, no military dispatch that mentioned the structure or the county road it sat beside. The official explanation for star forts is convincing enough on its surface that most people accept it and move on. The star-shaped design, developed in Renaissance Italy, refined by French military engineers in the 17th century, standard in European fortification theory by 1650, eliminates blind spots in cannon coverage. Any attacker approaching from any angle can be targeted without the defender's repositioning. The east coast of colonial and early national America was defended by dozens of them, the story goes, because the young republic needed coastal protection against European naval power. Some of them fit this story precisely. The Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine commands the harbour mouth directly. Fort Monroe controls the entrance to the Chesapeake. You look at them on a map and the logic is self-evident. The placement, the sight lines, the relationship to navigable water. But the ones that don't fit that logic are not rare exceptions. They are the majority. The National Park Service has documented more than 300 surviving star-shaped earthworks east of the Appalachians. Researchers estimate the original count was substantially higher. Many were levelled for farmland across the 19th century, their careful angles erased by ploughs without record or ceremony. When you map the surviving ones, the distribution contradicts the military explanation almost immediately. They do not cluster along the coastline. They cluster along river systems and at inland intersections, not where an enemy fleet would arrive, but where roads crossed, where rivers became navigable, where the earliest colonial land offices were established. In 4 separate counties across Virginia and North Carolina, I found documented star forts sitting within 2 miles of the first federal land office for their region, not defending the region, positioned at its administrative centre. The military explanation required for each of these a chain of assumptions the physical record refused to support. That armies would approach through dense inland forest rather than by sea. That a structure with no artillery platform and no barracks was still a military installation. That its position at a land office intersection was coincidence rather than function. Not coincidence, pattern. There is another way to read the placement. The Land Ordinance of May 20th, 1785 established a geometric vision for the new republic. the entire public domain divided into townships 6 miles square, subdivided into numbered sections, surveyed and administered by federal authority. To execute a grid of that scale across hundreds of miles of unmapped landscape, you need fixed reference points, permanent, precisely placed anchors from which measurements can be extended with confidence and verified across years and teams. The grid drifts without them. Measurements compound their errors. You need something already placed with exactness. The star forts were already placed with exactness. The survey teams knew it. Their field notes say so. The question the field notes don't answer is the same one Jefferson asked in 1816 and never received a reply to. Who placed them, and what exactly were they for? The General Land Office was established by Congress on April 25, 1812, with a mandate to survey, administer, and sell the public domain. What its founding records reveal, preserved in the National Archives, largely uncatalogued and rarely cited, is that its field teams did not begin their work from nothing. The instructions issued to the first surveyors general directed them explicitly to identify and use existing permanent structures as control points, fixed anchors, established works. The field instructions name these anchors with a consistency that is itself a kind of evidence, works of established precision. The star forts appear on the earliest federal survey maps as exactly that, not as military installations, but as the fixed points from which the grid extended outward. Jared Mansfield was appointed Surveyor General of the United States by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. His correspondence, held in the National Archives, documents in his own language the practice his teams relied on. In a letter to Jefferson dated the spring of 1806, Mansfield describes the challenge of running accurate meridians across unsurveyed territory in the Old Northwest, and the value of what he calls precisely permanent works already placed with exactness. He does not name who placed them. He does not speculate about their origin. He records only that they were there, that their geometry was reliable, and that his teams had built their baselines from them. Jefferson received the letter. There is no record that he asked the obvious question. This matters because the survey grid was not a technical exercise. It was the mechanism of economic power in the early republic, the infrastructure through which the federal government established legal land title, determined the size of grants, calculated what was owed, and documented who owned what. Land that could be measured could be taxed. Land that could be taxed could be financed. The reference points that made the entire system coherent and reproducible across hundreds of miles were not incidental. They were foundational, and the star forts, placed at the intersections where survey baselines converged, at the nodes where administrative authority was first extended into unsettled territory, were the foundation. Between 1785 and 1820, survey teams operating under the authority of the Land Ordinance documented star-shaped earthworks as reference stations in Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and across the Old Northwest Territory. The pattern of placement is consistent and specific. The structures appear at the points where the principal meridians and baselines of the federal grid were anchored. They appear at the earliest post-road intersections. They appear, in documented case after documented case, within 2 miles of the first federal land office established for their region. Not defending the region, administering it. I kept returning to the gap that Mansfield's letter opens and does not close. The structures predated the surveyors who used them. They predated, in documented cases across 5 states, the earliest known settlements near them. Someone placed them with professional precision at locations that would prove essential to a federal administrative system that did not yet exist when the structures were built. The official record does not say who commissioned them or when. It records only that they were there, that they were reliable, and that the government used them. Here is where the second pattern begins. The 1860s and 1870s, the same decade that signed the National Banking Act into law on February 25, 1863, by a Senate margin of 23 to 21. The same decade that imposed a 10% tax on state banknotes by 1865, effectively destroying them. The same decade the first comprehensive federal census documented every American by name, also transformed the official classification of these structures. Before 1865, federal land records and surveyor correspondence described star-shaped earthworks as survey stations, reference works, and established works. After 1870, without recorded debate, without a published administrative order, without a single document explaining the reclassification, the terminology shifts entirely. In federal archives, in the emerging literature of military history, in the newly reorganized files of the War Department, they become fortifications. The structures did not change. The name used for them did. In the same decade that the name used for currency, for land title, for community credit, and for personal identity all changed simultaneously. Each of these transformations arrived in the same 10-year window. Each reinforced the others. The old survey language disappeared from the official record at the same moment the structures themselves became, legally and historically, something else. You cannot access the original administrative function once the administrative category no longer exists. You cannot ask what the works were built for once the works have been reclassified as military history and the question becomes officially already answered. Not coincidence, pattern. There is a star fort in Beaufort, North Carolina, that the National Park Service classifies as a Civil War defensive earthwork. The Carteret County Preservation Society has been contesting that classification for more than a decade. Their case is straightforward. Soil stratigraphy conducted in 2009 places the structure at least 60 years before the Civil War. It contains no artillery emplacements. Its earliest documented appearance is on an 1801 coastal survey map. Not a military document, but a record produced by the newly established Survey of the Coast, which used star-shaped earthworks as triangulation, reference stations for accurate shoreline measurements. The Society petitioned for reclassification in 2013. Denied without published explanation. They filed again in 2017, with a full stratigraphic report and 3 additional survey maps. Denied again, reclassification, the official response, stated would require significant administrative review. The Society's president, a retired county surveyor, told a local paper that the process felt less like slowness and more like institutional resistance. He chose his words with visible care. The classification, he said, seems load-bearing. He meant that the category does work. A military fort has a history that is documented, explained, closed. A survey reference station has a history that is open, one that leads directly to questions the official record cannot answer. Who commissioned these structures? Who built them? Under whose authority? Before the federal survey system formally existed. The category forecloses the inquiry. Once the structure is a fort, the story is finished. Sometimes I stop and ask whether I'm reading connections that are not there. The reclassification of the 1860s and 1870s could be bureaucratic carelessness rather than deliberate erasure. Archives become disorganized for mundane reasons, categories, get applied carelessly and persist through institutional inertia. The Beaufort denial could be slowness rather than resistance. The silence in Mansfield's correspondence, his careful avoidance of the question of origin, could be professional incuriosity rather than something he understood and chose not to record. But the survey records exist, the placement matches. 2 surveyors general name these structures as established reference works in their own correspondence. The reclassification occurred in exactly the decade when the old administrative language disappeared across every category it touched: currency, land title, community credit, personal documentation. The Preservation Society needed federal permission to describe a structure on their own county's land. They asked twice. The answer was no. The forts didn't disappear. The explanation for them did. I went back to Virginia in late October. Back to the dirt road, back to the field, back to the earthwork my father had stood in front of in 1987 without knowing what it was. The grass was longer than on my first visit. The 6 points of the star extended outward from the centre, with the same patient precision I had first noticed years before, each angle exactly where the geometry said it should be. No marker, no sign. No explanation offered to anyone who might stop and look. Just the geometry. Patient and still waiting. I stood at the edge for a long time, thinking about Jared Mansfield writing to Thomas Jefferson about permanent works placed with exactness, and neither of them ever recording who placed them or why. About Clarence King, the first director of the United States Geological Survey, whose field reports named star-shaped earthworks as the most reliable reference points on the eastern seaboard, and noted nothing further about their origin. About a retired county surveyor in North Carolina, choosing the specific phrase load-bearing with such deliberate care. I don't have answers. I have the pattern and what the pattern implies. Why do so many star forts appear at survey grid intersections rather than at the coastal positions the military theory requires? Why does the Surveyor General's own correspondence name them as administrative anchors, while every public-facing document calls them fortifications? Why does their reclassification occur in the same decade that state currencies were taxed out of existence? That the first comprehensive census documented every American by name, that land title became enforceable only through the new national banking system? Why does a county preservation society need federal permission to describe a structure on their own land? And why is that permission denied? Why does every attempt to trace who built these structures, who commissioned them, what system they served, arrive at the same wall in the same decade? The sun dropped below the tree line. The earthwork held its shape in the fading light, the angles still sharp, the geometry still deliberate, the silence still complete. Somewhere in a shoebox at my parents' house, my father is holding a fish he caught, and behind him, already there, already waiting, is something no one has explained.